Wasted money on cures. Forgot how to fix myself. They say that time is free. Then why is it so precious? Oh, I'll say memories in my head, like Polaroids on walls. They remind you to look ahead. Time is running out. Time is running out. Lately I've lost my track. I've sailed the deepest seas, hoping to find something to bring back better times. Oh, I'll say memories in my head, like Polaroids on walls. They remind you to look ahead. But time is running out. 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 Time is running. Time is running out. Time is running out. What if my best days are over? They can't be over. They can't be over now. Time is running out. What if my best days are over? They can't be over now. Time is running out. Time is running out. Time is running out.
Okay, hi there, everybody. Welcome to our lunchtime session. People in the chat window saying what they've been having for lunch: brioche, the odd sandwich, a little bit of soup here and there. Personally, I've just been to a new restaurant in my local town called Karma. Karma. Yeah, there's no menu. You just get what you deserve. So, welcome to this session. This is on poverty and inequality. I've got three little mini case studies for you. We're going to focus on developed countries, well, the UK, and developing low-income countries in particular. So do join in if you get a chance. So you need to subscribe to the channel to be able to contribute to the chat. The student collective is unbelievable. The incredible quality of answers will take your breath away if you haven't joined us before. Here we go. Let's do a quick session on poverty and inequality. If it's okay with you, I just want to start with a few stats in case you want a bit of application to impress the examiners, although in many cases, of course, the application will be in the extracts you're given. Gini coefficient for the UK is 0.36, rounding up. It's actually been fairly stable or falling for the last 10 years or so. Relatively high inequality compared to the 80s. 1%, the richest 1% of people in the UK own 8% of all the disposable income. The 80-20 ratio, that's people at the 80th percentile to the 20th percentile, the ratio is 6.3. So people on the 80th percentile have 6.5 times the income of people at the 20th percentile. Quite a few of you will know about the Palmer ratio, the World Bank's preferred measure of inequality, which takes the income of the richest 10% and divides by the income of the bottom 40%. And for the UK, it's 1.5. In fact, there's only about 4 countries in the world that have a Palmer ratio of less than 1. In terms of relative poverty, Britain doesn't do too well. Just under a quarter of families live in relative poverty. That's families are living on less than 60% of median disposable income. That's 14 million people. And we have the highest child poverty in Europe as a continent, with 4.2 million children living in poor households. That's just under 1/3 of households living in poverty. So a bit of stats there to keep us going. Another chart which is quite useful is this one. Examiners sometimes like to give you this kind of data. And this one shows a growing divide between mean and median hourly earnings. So if you get a question on inequality, you need to know why the mean is greater than the median, and in terms of pounds per hour here, and why that gap is also getting larger. Okay, well, let's focus on the UK. I've got 3 sets of questions for you in our time together. Can you please, and again, we're practicing, all we're doing here in this session, we're just using the time to practice synoptic exam technique, micro, macro. And if you can get this nice, clear distinction, I think you'll be in great shape for Monday. So can you please give me 2 micro reasons for an increase in relative poverty in the UK? Have a go. Yeah, some nice answers are coming through. Madison talked about skills gaps. I think Yaya was talking about labour market failure. The key to this kind of question is to link relative poverty to something that relates to an individual household or a market or a labour market in particular. Now, Jacob talks about rising indirect taxes. That's probably more macro than micro. Maybe a bit of blurring of the distinction there. Lots of points from Pollace here. Low wages, unemployment, living costs. Now, again, crucially here, so I think this is quite a useful exercise. We need to focus on micro, macro. The best answers on Monday, the best students, the top scoring students, will make a distinction between micro and macro. That's why we practice. Bruno's talking about infrastructure differences between north and south, regional variations. Talks about regional demand for labour. That's kind of, again, a blurred line between micro and macro. Can I take you through my 2 answers? Here we go. So one, and many people talked about the growing gap in wages and earnings. I really want to see in an answer on this, real wages, the gap between mean and median. Many jobs have been a fall in real wages linked to the decline of heavy industry. Somebody mentioned Redcar there. Impact of globalization at a micro level. So globalization is a macro phenomenon, a process that has micro effects. Yes, a drop in trade union density was mentioned by a couple of people, and so there has been a fall in real wages at the bottom end, and I think there was some reference to monopsony power there. Was good. At the top end, of course, the bonus culture, particularly in financial and business services, and a big rise in executive pay relative to median incomes. And the other point, a couple of people were talking about labour market failure, which was terrific. I would talk about market failures in specific sectors, education, health and housing. So the depth of educational disadvantage was laid bare, wasn't it, by the pandemic? The digital divide, the access to teaching online, the high percentage of young people who are NEET. I think is it 11% of young people are on NEET. Many people aren't in work but stuck in low paying work with limited training, allied to the lack of affordable housing, chronic poor health. All of these things increase relative poverty. Relative poverty is multi-causal, it's multi-layered. There's no unique cause, and therefore it's problematic in terms of policy. Moving on, well done, some good answers there. Anonymous says, Jeff, is investment in education, infrastructure, micro, macro? Great question. If you're talking about total government spending on education, that becomes macro because it's part of fiscal policy. But if you're talking about educational investments for children in deprived areas, localities, if you're talking about specific interventions in terms of childcare subsidies for families on low incomes, that becomes micro, because you're going down a level. You're going down towards the level of the firm, the household, the community, the industry. Eros says, what's neat, not in employment, education, or training. Moving on. Can you give me 2 macro reasons? Synoptic thinking, everybody. Have a go for a minute. So I think both Shale and Harsaran both brought in the globalization perspective. And again, if you're making those links, those synoptic connections, that's what it's all about on Monday. Synopticity just means they can ask you anything they like, but they're particularly one example at Excel board, they like to make this clear distinction between micro and macro. So Luca, they're talking about national education provision, and maybe underinvestment in training and a lack of human capital. Holly's point, demographic trends, an aging population, pensioners with little income pushed into poverty, hit by the cost of living crisis. That would be a really good macro point because the population, the pensioners are a specific demographic, but at a national level. Laura made an amazing point in the previous session as well. Rising interest rates, which have a greater impact on low-income households with a high MPC. So particularly there, that would target those households who are vulnerable to debt, one paycheck away or one bill away from having to borrow money. They have fewer savings to rely on as a safety net. Absolutely. And of course, one of the realities of the modern age is that people on low incomes pay higher interest rates on debt because they have to rely on unsecured debt, often from payday lenders. So that's hinting at regressive effects. I've gone for tax and benefits and globalization as my 2 factors. So there has been an extension of indirect taxes over the years. They tend to be regressive. And the state welfare benefit system has tended to become less generous in relative terms over time, including the welfare cap. So although the real value of benefits has stayed more or less the same, the relative value has gone down because people's earnings have risen by more than inflation until recently. And if anything, the welfare system has actually reduced pensioner poverty. They tended to favour, I wonder why they favour older people. Maybe it's because they vote more often or more regularly. The triple lock for pensions, which is where the government commits to increasing pensions by inflation or 2.5% or average earnings, whichever is the higher. And a lot of you talked about globalization, which is phenomenal, Shale and Harsaran in particular. So the benefits of globalization are not equally distributed. So there's a risk of structural unemployment, real wages falling in industries such as steel and shipbuilding and heavy manufacturing. That can cause relative poverty in particular sectors. Here's Kieran's question. Jeff, does rising inflation push people more towards absolute poverty as they have left money to spend on necessities? Well, I think you're making a valid point there, Kieran. If you think about the cost of living crisis, absolute poverty in the UK, of course, needs to be defined differently from another country. But the growing use of food banks, increased theft from supermarkets of basic items, and rising homelessness, for example, people can't afford to rent or buy. The depth of, I would call it absolute poverty or just persistent poverty, multi-deprivational poverty, has undoubtedly increased in the UK, despite the Gini coefficient having fallen a little bit. Here's a question from Joe. In your separate micro and macro paragraphs, do you need to make it clear which is which? Yes. Joe, this is terrific exam advice, so thank you for your question. I would tend to start my paragraphs by saying one micro cause could be, and then you build that point and evaluate it. And then the next point, one macro reason could be. That's called flagging, by the way. In the exam, flagging isn't getting tired. Flagging is telling the examiner this is what you're trying to explain. And a good examiner will just loves it when students map out their answer in that way. It just makes it easier to mark and easier to give the marks. So great question, Joe. Thanks for that. Let's move away from the UK a little bit. Think about developing countries. What I've done here is just chosen 7 countries of interest with a bit of inequality data from 2021, I think, using the Human Development Report. And who knows, there could be another development focus in one of the questions. What I've shown here, by the way, is the incomes held by the poorest 40% over the richest 10%. You can work out the Palmer ratio there. Look at those figures for the richest 1%. In Mozambique, they have nearly a third of the income. And in all of those countries, they have more than 10% of the income. And in all of those countries, apart from Ethiopia and Bangladesh, they have a Gini coefficient. India is quite low as well, isn't it? Gini coefficient, which is quite high. So there's a lot. They could well give you a poverty inequality question based around developing countries. On the basis of that, here's a challenge for you. Can you give me 2 micro effects of high relative poverty in a developing country? Have a go. Yeah, I think we're getting the idea here, which is super encouraging. Here's Vivan's answer. Lower dynamic efficiency for secondary sector firms as households have a high propensity to consume, won't be able to spend on luxuries classified as manufactured goods. Yeah, hinting there at quite a sophisticated response there. Vihar talked about profits and things. Come back to that in a second. Here's Rob's point. Oh yeah, this is really good because this is basically getting it to the level of the household. Let's look at Rob's answer here. Limited access to basic necessities, reduced educational opportunities, inadequate healthcare, lower living standards, limited social mobility. What Rob's doing there really successfully, I think, is linking inequality to basic development outcomes at the level of the household. That is micro, and that makes a big difference to the answer. And may lead to an increase in negative externalities due to consumption of demerit goods such as alcohol. A lot of people talking about crime, social dislocation. Quite a few of you would talk. I think Yaya was talking about falling supernormal profits. I think I've added that to one of my answers. Let's show my 2 answers here. So I've gone for human development and limited demand as my micro factors. So low income families, low per capita income, they lack access to basic education. They have to make key decisions on who to educate and for how long. Then we got that huge gap, that disconnects between mean and actual years of schooling. Access to healthcare, nutrition. So the risk of malnutrition, particularly amongst young children. They find it harder to save and a greater risk of borrowing at usurious rates of interest from informal, unregulated creditors. And critically, and this I think is a really important long-term point, relative poverty holds back demand. Yes, there is demand for luxury goods. Every country has their super rich and super wealthy who can afford luxury goods, but relative poverty holds back purchasing power. It does lead to lower demand because if you can address that, there's a fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, but it affects businesses. There's less production at scale, lower profits, employment is hit, real wages. George says usurious. Jeff showing off his Cambridge education there. Well, I've been doing that for 40 years, George. Why stop now? James Hendry has an interesting point. Could you say a developing country might not have a proper healthcare system. So if they don't live in a sanitary household, it could cause loss of work days. Yeah, absolutely. Relative poverty, persistent poverty, deep poverty means that people cannot live the lives that they deserve and that they might have thought they were going to have. It holds back a country's productive potential. Now, what we're talking about here is the micro effects. So the best answers on Monday will get to the micro foundations of the impact of these things. Micro foundations are critical to macro outcomes. With that in mind, let's answer the next, have a look at the next question. Can you give me 2 macro effects of high relative poverty for a developing country? Please have a go. So Laura brings in the Howard-Doma model, which is super important. Obviously, it limits savings ability. If you don't have the effective income, you can't afford to save. You're living from hand to mouth, literally. Alex Howard wanted to bring in an evaluative point, which I thought was quite handy. He wanted to play devil's advocate a little bit and say that there could be some positive consequences in terms of making a country attractive to inward FDI. Don't forget, capital tends to move to countries where unit labour costs are lowest, other things remaining the same. Lots of potential points here. I'm conscious of time, so let me give you my thoughts. But I like what you were doing here. If you read through the text on the live chat, it really is unbelievable. I mean, it's off the scale, quite honestly. I talked about limited tax base. So if you have relative poverty, with very low per capita incomes and inequality at the bottom end, the tax to GDP ratio is low. So the government's just not getting in the tax revenues to fund basic public services, education, healthcare, housing, infrastructure. And as a result, as a consequence, a lot of countries then decide to borrow the money to fund the infrastructure, often from overseas. And of course, that then links into national debt and external debt and debt servicing, so on and so forth. And I think nice macro points, people trying to bring in aggregate supply, competitiveness. If you have a high relative poverty, that creates market failures. People don't get the education and healthcare they need or deserve. So again, that probably makes it harder to attract inward investment, to foster innovation, and critically, to grow higher value added industries. On that point, let me just show you 2 little maps here. Those of you who follow OEC.world, the great website produced by one of my heroes, Cesar Hidalgo and Ricardo Hausman from Harvard University. This is the product space map. Basically, it's a forest. Every little circle is a product within an industry. Now, this is for Bangladesh, which we talked about in the previous session, if you remember back. Bangladesh, more than 80% of their exports are textiles. Textiles is green. So look onto the right-hand side here. Every time a dot is coloured in, that is an industry in which they export products. The bigger the size of the dot, the more the value of the exports. But can you see that most of the dots, most of the trees in this forest are not coloured in, which suggests that Bangladesh has a very strong dependency on light manufacturing and textile, because most of those dots are just grey dots. That means they don't have a recognised industry to produce for domestic and external exporting. Now, what I'm going to hope Jim will be able to do in the cellar is just flip to the next one, which shows South Korea, and go back and forth a few times. So what you're seeing here is the Bangladesh map and the South Korean map. And can you see here that South Korea has many more trees in the forest which are coloured in across a wider range of industries. So one reason why South Korea is richer than Bangladesh, many times richer, because it's got more industries with greater value added and more export sectors. It's a more diversified, complex, capable economy. And if we just go one more flip, Bangladesh, limited but significant scale capacity in textiles, contrasted with South Korea, which has scale across a large number of industries. There's the South Korean map coming up. So I think this is super important, and I'll give you a fundamental point right at the end about how to reduce poverty in these countries. Amazing clicking skills by Jim. Now, you may well get, we're going to finish off with a question on policy. I know there was a question about free market versus interventionist development policies, but there could well be a question about policies to tackle inequality or poverty. And of course, you've got this free market versus interventionist approach. Free market economists have every right to believe that lower taxes is the way to drive growth, and growth can reduce poverty because of the trickle-down effects. Critics argue, I will be one of them, from a Keynesian perspective, that trickle-down economics is largely a myth, and that you need pro-poor interventions at a micro level often to make a big difference to inequality. Okay, so here we go. 2 more questions to finish with. Again, thinking synoptically, can you give me 2 micro policies, micro strategies to lower poverty and inequality in the lowest income countries? Have a go, please. Thank you, Jody, for contributing. Really appreciate it. The quality of answers is great. Again, we're trying to focus on microeconomics here. Eleanor's point, increasing education for low income to help them become more skilled, increase the welfare benefits, bring themselves out of poverty. Now Rob has his micro hat on. Targeted social assistance programs, investment in skills and training, access to credit, entrepreneurship. The key here is to try and link it to specific industries or sectors, or I mean, you are getting very close to that on the micro side. Some great answers there. What else? We've got loads of points coming up. Here are my 2 answers, unless Jim's found something else. Yeah, well, I wanted to talk about financial markets, indeed. So at a micro level, promote financial inclusion. So expanding access to affordable financial services, such as savings accounts, microcredit, microinsurance. George, I think, made a point in the pre-live session that Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, I think, the economist from Bangladesh, created the Grameen Bank, of course. Microcredit, microfinance, in theory, is hugely important. Here it is. Fantastic guy invested something with a noble cause, sadly been misused to the detriment of those it hoped to assist. Literally this morning, George, I was listening to BBC Business or BBC World Business, their podcast. They had a double header on microfinance in Sri Lanka. Very, very hard to listen to because the microfinance sector in Sri Lanka is riddled with imperfections and problems, which have caused huge distress and damage to the country. So microfinance is many people's great hope for reducing poverty has turned out to be anything but in some countries, including the debt-torn country of Sri Lanka. But things like mobile money transfer, so getting telecoms companies to invest in these countries and set up mobile money networks, off-grid wireless and things, has really helped, along with remittances. And maybe, yeah, George says there must be more we can do. Challenger banks could hold the key to effective microfinance. I agree. One of the great joys of teaching for 37 years, feels like 137 years. I've got a load of students who now work in those areas, working in fintech in developing countries, and it is fascinating and hugely encouraging at the same time. The other point is to go to a micro level, focus on a particular industry. So I would argue that one of the ways of reducing poverty is to really try and drive commercial farming. If you can lift productivity and lift yields in farming, perhaps through use of buffer stocks, perhaps through just government funding of irrigation and proper storage, guaranteed minimum prices, interesting diagrams there. Those kind of things could, at the micro level, lift farmers out of poverty and encourage perhaps rural urban migration, so a country can sustain a higher level of farm output and release resources. Rosetta says, please explain microfinance. Well, probably ask George on that. He's the expert. But microfinance is basically allowing institutions to set up that provide very small scale loans and credit and insurance to the unbanked, to people who've never had a savings account before, to people who've never had an insurance policy before. And it's microfinance from the ground up tried to provide financial services to about 2 billion people in the world who have never had basic financial services. Okay, so last question. Can you give me 2 macro policies to lower poverty in the lowest income countries? 60 seconds, have a go. Is Ben's answers tax reforms, more progressive tax systems? Quite a few of you talked about that. Implementation of universal basic income, minimum wages across the country, subsidies to the secondary sector, industrialization as a way of trying to reduce poverty. I'll come back to that in a second, Ben. Actually, I've got a line for you on that one. Holly talks about supply side infrastructure investment, creates jobs where there isn't a demand side problem. Really good points. Lots of really good points coming through. Absolutely fantastic. People talking about government spending on public goods. I mean, loads of different points. Here are my 2 answers. Just to round off, yeah, infrastructure. So, government spending money, investing critical infrastructure. I don't know what the word critical means. Actually, I haven't got a clue, but it sounds good, doesn't it? My students would say this. So what about critical 3rd generation infrastructure? That sounds even better. But having a good transport system, having good electricity, good, reliable, low-cost electricity, telecoms, all of these things can lower supply costs, enhance connectivity, and obviously you need infrastructure to attract the FDI. And of course, infrastructure is triple powered. It increases aggregate demand, it increases aggregate supply in the short run by lowering costs, and in the long run by increasing capacity. Ultimately, you've got to reduce poverty, you have to lift people out of poverty. And the way to do that is to increase per capita incomes. The way to do that is to raise productivity. I'll come back to that in a second. But FDI is hugely important. Targeted social assistance, so things like conditional cash transfers. You may have studied these in countries such as Brazil, Bolsa Familia in Brazil, Mexico. Others argue that microfinance and conditional cash transfers are less effective than direct cash transfers promoted by charities such as Give Directly, whose president is Rory Stewart. Give Directly, by the way, came out of Harvard University. And as Rosetta pointed out, perhaps, just perhaps, we might experiment with some form of UBI. Luca says, for Edexcel, is the 25 marker sourced based? Yes, it is, Luca. For Edexcel, all of the application you need will be in the extracts. So you need to put the data in the answers. But you can always add in your own flourishes and your own extra content and insight, particularly in the evaluation sections. But all the data you need for the application is in the extracts. And Luke says, I thought that microfinance was macro syllabus. Well, it does appear on the macro syllabus. But again, here we go, it's synoptic. So it doesn't matter what theme 1 to theme 4 is. Synoptic is just throw everything, a bit like, whatever, throwing in some custard, some milk, and some whatever, eggs into a bowl and seeing what you get. So macroeconomics has micro foundations. Really important. Sam Diddy says, Rory Stewart is my therapist, basically. Well, I don't think there's any doubt that listening to the rest of his politics twice a week is food for the brain and balm for the soul. Oh, can I just quickly show Jim the slide on productivity? I just wanted to make a really key point. Here we go. Yeah, there's no question in my mind. I've studied this. I've studied economics, whatever, for 40 plus years, been teaching it for nearly 40 years, and obviously influenced by where I studied and who I've read over the years. But the main determinant of per capita incomes is productivity, right? So productivity isn't the only thing. It's pretty close. So just look at this chart. This just shows productivity in Germany. This is the GDP per hour worked, isn't it? Yeah, dollars per hour. Germany, United States leading. This is before the pandemic. UK, South Korea, Malaysia and South Africa stuck at middle income levels. China, India, Nigeria, Cambodia. Look, productivity and per capita incomes are so closely linked. So if you want to reduce poverty, you have to raise productivity. And the main source or sources of higher productivity are urbanization and higher productivity initially in farming, then in manufacturing, then in services. And then you grow the economy in other ways through ideas and dynamic efficiency and so on and so forth. So fundamentally, development is really quite simple. It's about creating formal jobs for people in reasonably well-paid work that makes them more productive. That's what it's all about. Okay, folks, unbelievable contributions. We've got one more session to go. I think I've done now 27 live streams since the start of Easter. Could be 28, but it's pretty high. Sunday, we're going to have a little get together for 15, 20 minutes. I'll answer your questions. It's a warm-up session, I think 6 o'clock on Sunday, ahead of paper 3. It's our last session together, really. So I thought we'd just have 20 minutes before the big dogs on YouTube arrive later on in the evening to share thoughts, to share ideas, just to give you a bit of confidence, answer your questions ahead of paper 3 on Monday. We'll be quite busy over the weekend on Insta and TikTok, just adding those little short videos on key topics. If there's anything you'd like me to record, 60 seconds on something, post it in the chat or post it in the comment section of this video. Warm is on Sunday, and then we're done, aren't we? After Monday, A-level economics is over. I must say it has been one of the privileges of my long teaching career to teach you lot over the last couple of months. We've just had an amazing group that's come together and shared thoughts, shared ideas, contributed in the chat, been very supportive of each other. And who knows, many of you may well meet up at university and raise a glass, perhaps, glass to tutor to you. I'll do the same after Monday. Do your best on Monday. Do your very best. You're in great shape. Hopefully we've supported you along the way. If you've enjoyed the session, please give the video a like. If you haven't enjoyed it, please give the video a like. And then let's meet up on Sunday for 20 minutes. And then we all head in our different directions into the fantastic, exciting challenges that lie ahead. So everybody, take care, stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy, stay curious, and see you sometime soon.